widow burning. No matter how many times Hindu cultures in Nepal and India, the governments try to outlaw it and stop it, it keeps going. So what do you do with a widow? Well, the widow needs to burn herself so that she can go join her husband. Because what value does she have? Not only is it an act of just hopelessness because I can't provide, it's you have a religious responsibility as a widow to burn yourself and go join your husband, and then you can be reincarnated with him. And that's so strong in their culture that the government literally cannot get rid of it. When I went to the nation of Nepal, it was one of the first times I've been in a country where there's this much oppression, this much poverty. And it really was, it was stark for me. It was just this eye-opener. And it's one of the reasons I took my boys to Cambodia a couple of weeks ago, because my daughter had been to poor countries and done ministry in orphanages, but my boys never had. And even for my 16-year-old, the first time we were outside of Angkor Wat Temple, and these 2 and 3 and 4-year-old kids start coming up to beg. And sometimes they even at least have something to sell, and the only thing they know in English is $1. They just keep saying that phrase over and over and over again. $1, $1, $1, and literally just follow you for sometimes up to a mile, hoping that eventually you'll cave in, eventually you'll give money. And there's big signs up from the government saying don't give to the kids, because if you give to the kids, they won't go to school. Why should they go to school if they can earn money here at the temple begging? And so my son he didn't even know what to do. He didn't even know how to process. How do you know, my daughter's heart breaks because she's already been to poor countries and helped orphans, but she's trying to think long term, how can we help these people? And as she goes to college. And that's why it was so impressive, knowing the background of how brutal and oppressive Hindu culture is to women, and then going to the YWAM base, and the DTS school leader was a woman. You know, and thinking, wow, what a statement that is to their society. What a radical turnaround that is. What a role model it is. What a cultural bomb that is to the people. We had a student here when I was school leader of the SBS, and her name was Heather. Heather was someone who aspired to be an Olympic gymnast. And she had all kinds of promise when she was a young girl to be an Olympic gymnast, so she dropped out of normal school. She went to Texas and began to work out in kind of the official Olympic training program. And at age 14, her knee blew out. And she really couldn't, after surgery, couldn't even get up and walk around very much. And because of all that happened in her life, she was so far behind in her schooling. You know, because she was just doing kind of schooling on the go, and the Olympics were her dream, and so she didn't really care if she could read and write and do that stuff very well. And so when she enrolled in the SBS, it was brutal. The same work that would take a normal SBS student an hour would take her 4 hours. And you just can't do that at an SBS. You can't get behind. And so she was just struggling to get work done. And I sat down with her, and of course, you just want to say, well, maybe your educational level is just not high enough. And she begged me to stay in the school. Begged me to stay in the school. And so she did. She'd just work and work and work and work for a C-. But she was able to keep those grades at least to stay in the system. And when we graduated, we had outreach, and she said, I know I want to go to Nepal. And Heather had no money. No money at all to go. And so I said, you know, the outreach deadline has passed. You know, we all prayed with you, but you didn't have the money. She's like, I'm still going. I'm like, you have to buy a ticket, you know. And so she's like, I've got enough money to get me to the States, so I'm going to buy that ticket to go to the States and just trust that God's going to provide the rest for me to get there. She's an adult. I can't stop her from doing that. And I just think, oh man, I really hope this works out for her. So she goes to the States, she runs into that total YWAM story that I told you about. They provided enough money for her to get to Nepal. She gets into Nepal, joins the team, and she's pretty much never left. They've literally kicked her out of the country several times. She just goes back in, right? Because she said, that's Nepal. They don't have like a real computerized system. They don't really know they keep kicking me out and I keep getting back in. Right? She's been kidnapped. Literally, like a van drove up, threw her in the van. They're driving her up into the hills. She opens the doors, jumps out. Right? Jumps out of the van while it's moving, goes back into town, keeps ministering, does not leave. And she's ministering to the people there. She's doing women's Bible studies. She works together with orphans. And praise the Lord that God protected her and her family during the recent earthquake. This is a picture that she loaded up because they were sleeping outside their house. The quake got so bad they moved even further away from the house, and they're in a tent in their backyard right now. And that's her husband. He's Nepali, and her kids. And they just have this amazing ministry working with people that are poor, people that are oppressed, people that feel like nobody cares, that they've been forgotten about. And so just like Ruth, she didn't give up. All the things were stacked against her in her life, and she saw profound change. She saved Naomi's life, and she ended up being in the lineage of Jesus. It's still possible today. We can be the Ruths, right? And so I just want to encourage us to think about Ruth in a different way. All right, let's take our big break. Let's take our 15-minute break. And at about 5 till, let's come back.
give you a contact for
Do you like the brand
Oh yeah. I can't believe people can actually do that. Like beats are cool different things. It's like it's all good, you know. So the good, but you were like a master. It didn't leave you in like yeah. But it kind of does show you that the music, like majors and the guys, they all like literally like a lot more than like really have to like get up there. I like that. It's so like I just thought it was like it was really sad though how the guy in the movie like gave up his relationship like hated his family because they he was doing that like why does he have this ambition that is actually ruining his life? So sad, like such a big that's kind of show like what you want to do. It does show like the sad reality of it, but then to one man determination, going through all the bullcrap, at the end he just becomes like a boss. Kind of like I think like all like music students is like kind of like that. I actually like it to describe SBS. I feel like this time I would be what I was thinking I enjoy TS. When people read out, I just go like, where your phone? All that for Exodus 5. So one Exodus 5.
music.
Hey, just want to say thank you to the snack crew.
Snacks.
It's always a good day when you have frozen yogurt, right?
Yeah.
It's like the king of all snacks right there. All right, John.
Yeah. All right, we are going to radically shift gears. It's Friday. It's Aloha Friday. I'd like to be able to sing the song for you, no work till Monday, but that's just not going to happen for you. There's lots of work. When I lived here, hey, it was Hawaii, and so I had a nice collection of Aloha shirts. And I kept them for like years after we moved, and finally just got rid of them. And then I see everybody wearing their Aloha wear, and just makes me feel sad that my Aloha gear is gone. Amazingly, it's not popular in Taiwan. I'm not sure why. It just hasn't really caught on yet in Taiwan.
It will.
It will. Just give it time. All right, so we're going to shift gears. We're out of the narratives. We are leaving Israel and their history behind, and we're diving into the section that we called the writings. Actually, we've already left that. You may not realize that. We talked about, you have the Pentateuch, the books of Moses. Then it was followed by the former prophets. That was Joshua all the way through 2 Kings. Then you have the latter prophets, the ones we think more of as prophets. And then you had the writings. Ruth is actually part of the writings. Even though we think Ruth would belong in the former prophets, because it just fits there nicely in between Joshua, Judges, and then Samuel, it is part of the writings. And every year, the book of Ruth is read at the Feast of Pentecost. That's when they read through that, because certain books of the writings are read through at the Jewish festivals. So we've already made our kind of shift into the writings, but obviously the biggest book in the writings are the Psalms. And so we're going to spend about the next 2 hours as we close out today talking about, our hour and a half, however long we have, talking about the Psalms. And how do we read the Psalms? How do we apply the Psalms? And yet, what I want to do is to try to give you also a bigger picture of worship. You know, what does worship look like so far in the books you've gone through, from Genesis now all the way up through to Psalms? Now, for me, I have a lot of different background experiences with worship that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But as I said, right now I'm pastoring a church in Taiwan. And it's kind of a church plant. We're really growing, but it's taking us time. And one of the things I didn't realize when I was in YWAM, I think, is how blessed I was in the area of worship. I mean, I was in YWAM for 17 years. And so after 17 years, it's kind of like, we got great worship leaders. We worship a couple of times a week. Like, it just becomes normal. You're just so used to the fact that you have some of the most talented worship leaders in the world. And on Thursday nights, and then Monday mornings, and then we had worship as a class all the time, and there were talented people leading that. And it wasn't just that they were talented musicians. It's that you really felt that they understood the focus and the heart and the purpose of worship. And there was a freedom of expression, whether that was dance or whether that was in the lifting of hands. You felt like there was an openness to the Holy Spirit, to the Spirit to really move in the prophetic. And so, after 17 years, it's just normal. And you're like, maybe I'll just skip worship. I need to get ready for this next book. Or, it's just worship again. Who needs to go to worship, no matter if I lose participation points or not? I'll just skip worship and I'll go do my homework, or I'll go into town or whatever. Because it's just worship. And when we moved to Taiwan, it was clear right away how much I was going to miss worship. Because the church that I'm a pastor at, when I was just going there, no full-time worship leader. And it's really also a mix of all these different missions organizations that have come together to plant it. And some of those are not really that open to the Holy Spirit. So it was kind of a question, can we even work together? Could I even go to a church that doesn't allow speaking in tongues. Literally written into the policies and guidelines at corporate worship sessions, you cannot speak in tongues. And so that kind of gives you a little bit of the overall vibe of the church that, yes, you can pray for people, but you're probably not going to see much of the manifestation of the gifts that we have in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. So could I even work with that? I'd like to say that that became kind of the bigger question, but really what it came down to is, can I survive another week of this horrible worship? Right? Because we didn't have a full-time worship leader, and so we just take volunteers. And so our quality of our worship leading was just up and down, but mostly down. People who they didn't spend a whole lot of time practicing, either because they were students. We had a lot of high school students, and that's not a bad thing if they really know how to lead worship and they'll actually practice. But sometimes they would get there and literally the 15 minutes before church is worship practice. And so they just struggle through. Now, because we're a bilingual church, it's even more complicated, because we should really be singing either one verse in English and then one verse in Mandarin, or we should be singing one song in Mandarin and then one song in English. Well, if you're an English-speaking person, you may not feel that comfortable singing in Mandarin. And you may not know that many songs, and vice versa. So we tend to sing the same songs over and over and over and over again. And so you're sitting there going, oh, what are we going to do? Now I'm in charge. Now I'm the pastor, so now I'm responsible for worship. And I start thinking, maybe it's time to bust out all this new emerging creative worship that doesn't involve instruments, because we just don't have people who can do that kind of thing. Or maybe I'll just go the other route. I got a friend who's planting a church in Cambodia. They just YouTube it up. Right? They just pull up YouTube and they pick out their songs, and then they watch the video, and it's got PowerPoint, it's got the lyrics, it's got people who can actually sing, and that's how they lead worship. And I was really about at that point to suggest maybe we should just YouTube worship it, because it just seems like it's so bad. And it was during that time that I was preparing to teach the Psalms in an SBS in Australia. And as I was preparing, God began to really convict me of my pretty rotten attitude when it came to worship. Not only had I really not appreciated it when I was back in YWAM, but I wasn't understanding what worship was about as a pastor. And I wasn't understanding what it should look like for our church and whether God was pleased with it or not. Really, who cared whether I was happy with it? Was God pleased with our worship? And so I went back and went through from Genesis on and began to kind of look at this theme of worship. And I went back and just kind of redid my whole Psalms lecture, trying to think through, what do the Psalms communicate to us about worship? Because if any book out of the whole Bible should be the one that we look to and understand what's God's heart for worship, it should be the Psalms. It really should be. And so what does it tell us about that? Well, for you, I just want to tell you, if you've come down or come from a very different background when it comes to worship, it's okay. I can probably understand it either way. Up until the time when I was about 11, I went to a Disciples of Christ church in a small town in Kentucky. And it was much more of high church worship, liturgical worship. In other words, if it wasn't in the program, it did not happen. Everything that happened in our worship service, you just open it up, pastor says this, church says that. We sing this hymn on this page, then we say this, then we do the doxology. Just word for word. There was no spontaneity that was ever going to happen at that church. And we were doing, again, the hymns and the doxologies that people have been doing for hundreds and even thousands of years. So this is what worship looked like when I was first in the church, what I remember. Hopefully the sound works. So can we just adjust the sound back there, just check it, make sure it's... Yep, we're good. All right, enjoy. Now, yeah, I have not been in that kind of a church, in this church, since I was probably 10 or 11. I still remember the words.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not kidding you. I still don't know what some of them mean. You know, what is a host? Why do we call him Holy Ghost? Is he like Casper? Is he flying around? But that, to me, this is what worship looked like. And as a 10-year-old, obviously, I thought it was boring. I didn't have an appreciation for liturgy, for tradition at this particular point. All I knew is that church is boring because we do the same thing week after week after week. So I became good friends with this kid in my class. His name was Ryan. And his parents got to know my parents, and they invited us to their church. And they were going to a little country Methodist church in this town called Grafenberg. And so, beautiful white church alongside of a river. Now, normally a Methodist church should have been very similar to this. However, it was experiencing revival. It was in the midst of a massive revival, and the Holy Spirit had just broken out in this little country church. And the pastor was just loving life. And so I went from this to this. Uh-oh. Where is it? We're now experiencing technical difficulties. Hang on just a second. Yeah. God's telling me, don't show this clip. Okay, you can turn the sound off for this one. We don't need the sound. It gets worse. No, that wasn't. That's why I said we don't need the sound. You get the general idea, right? I mean, it just goes on, and people start getting slain in the Spirit. People start falling over, and that guy's really into it. I love that guy. So imagine as an 10, 11-year-old going from doxology to that. Like, I mean, to me, I didn't know what was going on. It was a freak show. I mean, people are literally, I'm not kidding, there was an older guy who would literally circle the church. Like, he would start circling, running around. They had tambourines. They were beating their tambourines. There were people up front getting slain in the Spirit. There were people catching the people getting slain in the Spirit. There were people speaking in tongues. So just in the middle of worship, someone would stand up, they would speak out something in tongues, the pastor would go, okay, now we're going to wait for interpretation of tongues. Someone would get up and give an interpretation of tongues. And so my parents and our family was sitting as far back as possible in the church, right? And I talked to my parents, they were just like, oh, what are we doing, right? Like, what have we just landed in? Like, they're going to bust out the snakes next, right? Start doing some good old Kentucky charismatic snake handling, you know? And so I think they were getting ready to just kind of, you know, make a quick departure and go back to the doxologies. But they really started to meet the people there. And the people were passionate about Jesus. And my mom told me, she said that caught us. That even though we were freaked out by the charismatic worship, we saw that these people really loved Christ, and it made a difference, and they were genuine, and they loved on you, and they wanted to invest into your life. I mean, they would come over and disciple my parents and have Bible studies till like midnight, and I loved it because it meant my friend was over all the time. Right? But they saw something genuine in their faith. And that charismatic outbreak was so big that my pastor had to leave the Methodist church because the elders said, we don't want to build a bigger church. We have our nice little country church. We don't want it to change. So either you cut this revival cut the revival out or leave. So he left and started his own church. And that's the church that still supports us in missions today. It was still a rather interesting experience to take my wife to that church for the first time because she really wasn't raised as a Christian at all. And so this whole thing of worship, right? It's so different for some of us depending on our backgrounds. And maybe just even in this classroom, you're experiencing DTS or something like that. And so as I started to do research as a pastor, right, trying to understand God's heart for worship, and I started reading all these books that were about what worship should look like, I began to see that there was this kind of title over the discussion and the debate about worship called the Worship Wars. Worship Wars? I mean, how is that even possible? What do you mean worship wars? And as the more I read, the more I realized that inside the church, particularly in the 80s, the 90s, there's just this huge fight about worship. Should worship be liturgical? Should it be high church? Should worship be informal? Should you use guitars, right? And drums? So it wasn't, should worship then be interactive? Then the emerging church started speaking into it. And you had people like building mazes, and they're like, the maze is our worship service, or interactive worship. We just have stations, and you go to those stations. I mean, in YWAM, we've pretty much seen it all. I mean, during one of our worship times, we actually built the River of God at the Ohana Court. We literally built a big prophetic river through there, and as we commissioned outreach teams, we all went through the River of God. So we've done it all. I'm glad we weren't carrying electric guitars as we went through the River of God. But I mean, so, you know, you've kind of seen all the different expressions of worship. And yet now I'm a pastor of this church, and I'm thinking, well, what should it look like? Is it really about what kind of music? Or should we use music? Is it really about, well, should we do hymns? Or should we do more informal songs? And well, does it even matter that people can't sing in key? You know, so I think we keep these in mind as we dig in and say, okay, well, what's a biblical answer to this? That's kind of a good place to start, to say, what does the Bible have to say? What is our theology of worship from the Bible? In order to do that, we first got to define the word worship. We use the word worship, that's an English word that has its own roots, really from a place of awe or respect, like they used to call judges and kings, your worshipness. And it really traces back to worthy. When you say worship, it means that someone is worthy to be given awe and respect to. That's English. The Hebrew word that's used in the Old Testament for worship is a Hebrew word called shakah. It's that CH sound, that's that Hebrew has that guttural sound. So it's kind of fun to say, shakah. Right? And shakah, when it originally was used in Hebrew, it just meant to bow down, to prostrate yourself, to hit the dirt, to kiss people's feet. So it was a posture, it was an actual action that you did. And so most of the time, I won't say most of the time, some of the time when this is used in the Old Testament, that's all it really means. Like Abraham bowed down to a king, or Joseph's brothers bowed down to him. That's all it's describing as an action. However, whenever this word is used to describe someone's actions towards God, it's almost always translated as worship. That eventually this verb that just meant to kneel down, to hit the dirt, somehow eventually they got to assign that something that meant more than just a physical posture, a physical stance, but some action that people were doing towards God. And sometimes that meant singing, sometimes that meant prayer, sometimes that meant just respect and honor and humility. And so it kind of developed this word, shakah, into worshiping God. And so that's how it's used in the Old Testament. In fact, 80% of the time in the Old Testament where you see the word worship, it's this particular Hebrew word. Now, let's stop and think about that for a minute. Let's stop and think about that when they were looking for a word to describe what they wanted to reflect towards God, giving glory to God's name. They chose the verb that meant to literally get on your face. They could have chosen all kinds of verbs, like lift your hands, or singing, or giving glory, but they chose bow down, kneel down. Here's a picture. This is from an obelisk, an Assyrian obelisk from the time of King Jehu. You're going to read about him in the book of Kings. And this is the Assyrian king, obviously over here on the left. And here is Jehu. And you see what Jehu is doing? He is shakhaing. That's how it's described. He is literally bowing down before the king as a sign of humility, that the Assyrian king is more powerful, worthy of honor and respect, and they're delivering the tribute to this Assyrian king. So he shakhad to him. Now, if Jehu bows down, if he gets down on the floor, but then he goes out and he speaks ill, he speaks badly about the Assyrian king, he leads a rebellion, he does all these horrible things, does his act of bowing down have any value for the Assyrian king? Right? No. Right? It doesn't do you any good. So in their culture, to just bow down and get on the floor was meaningless unless you backed it up with a lifestyle. So it starts out and it's about a heart condition. It's about humility. It's about paying honor to someone who is greater than you are, who deserves glory and respect. However, it's connected to lifestyle. If you're not out there walking out a lifestyle that says, I honor this king, I obey this king, then your bowing down on the floor is worthless. And so that was something they wanted to communicate about worship. It is a heart attitude. It does mean that it's primarily an act of humbling yourself and recognizing the awesomeness of God, but it also has to be connected into your lifestyle. And that's why the second main Hebrew word that's used for worship is this Hebrew word that's pronounced abad. And the Hebrew word for abad, sometimes it's translated worship, but sometimes it's translated serve. So in these passages in Exodus, it should be really familiar to you. That's when Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, let my people go so that they might go into the wilderness for 3 days and abad. And it's translated in most of our Old Testaments now as worship. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in detail. So how could it be translated worship and how could it be translated serve? Okay, before we said that they took a word for bowing down. So it was humility, it was honoring, it was awe, it was obeisance. But now they're choosing a word that definitely has action orientation. To serve. And sometimes it's used when it's talking about the priests going into the temple. What did the priests do in the temple? They served. There was something, not just a heart attitude, but they were doing something. There was an action involved. And in Exodus 20, verse 5, it talks about that God really, again, for his people, he says, don't abad other gods. Don't serve other gods. You shall serve the Lord only. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that it's more than just lip service. From the very beginning, it's more than just singing. It's more than just a catchy tune that you play on your harp. It's more than just whether you raise your hands or whether you get onto your face. It's about a type of awe, a type of reverence that's connected into the way you live your life. That's connected into do you back up your worship with your lifestyle? And that's the only kind of worship that God was actually desiring. Hold your finger here and look at Isaiah. Isaiah's got a very, very direct word from the Lord about how he feels about worship that becomes ritual. Worship that just becomes actions disconnected from lifestyle. Okay, chapter 58. Okay, chapter 58. And we'll start with, I'll read verse 2. It says, yet they seek me daily, and they delight to know my ways. He's being sarcastic. As if they were a nation that did righteousness, and did not forsake the judgment of their God. And they ask me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. Why have we fasted, and you see it not? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you take no knowledge of it? Behold, in the day you are fast, you seek your own pleasure, and you oppress all your workers. Behold, you fast only to quarrel, and to fight, and to hit with a wicked fist. Fasting like yours this day will not make your voice to be heard on high. Is such the fast that I choose, a day for a person to humble himself? Is it to bow down his head like a reed and spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Will you call this fast and a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? And in the prophets, God says this repeatedly through numerous prophets. Stop your hypocritical worship. Just stop, please. I'm not receiving it. It doesn't make you heard. In fact, it makes me sick, is basically what God is saying. If you just do worship and it's disconnected from lifestyle, he said, quit literally fasting and just quit oppressing the poor. I want to fast from oppression, a fast from sin. That's the thing that I want from you in your worship. So you'll see that hopefully as you trace that through. Right, so it starts out with Father Abram. So let's look back at Genesis chapter 12. Like I said, you've kind of done several books of the Old Testament now. And we're just going to hit some highlights of worship in those particular books. So would someone read Genesis chapter 12 and then specifically verses 6 through 8. Genesis 12 verses 6 through 8.
Abraham traveled through the land as far as Shechem. There he set up a camp beside the oak of Moreh. At this time the area was inhabited by Canaanites. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your descendants. And Abraham built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord, who had appeared to him. After that, Abraham traveled south and set up camp in the hill country with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. There he built another altar and dedicated it to the Lord, and he worshipped the Lord.
Yeah, I love this passage because it reminds us of the simplicity of Abraham's faith, the simplicity of his worship. So think about it. At this point, this is somewhere around maybe 1800 BC, 1900 BC. There's no law, right? There's no Mosaic covenant. There's no priesthood. There's no tabernacle. There's no sacrificial system. All the trappings of Israelite religion that we are used to, they're not there. So you sometimes wonder, how did Abraham know anything? How did Abraham really figure out what God would desire in his life and what things to do? And yet, to me, sometimes it just removes all the noise. All the noise of all the rules and regulations and everything, and it just gets to the true heart of what it looked like to Abram. So what did worship look like to Abram? How does it describe? How did he worship? He built an altar. He piled up some rocks. That's impressive, right? He just took some rocks and just kind of put them in a pile. That's not that complicated. I think I can cut that. And then his worship, in the Hebrew, it says he calls on the name of the Lord. In your translation, it said he worshiped, but literally in Hebrew, he calls out the name of the Lord. What did that look like? Was he raising his hands? Was he speaking in tongues? Was he exercising gifts? Was he playing a harp? I mean, we don't know. The Bible doesn't see fit here to give us any specific detail other than a pile of rocks, and he called out Yahweh, or whatever name he knew God by at that particular time. Because Yahweh is the name that was revealed to Moses. So it's just that simple though. And God receives his worship. God is pleased with his worship. And this is pretty much how Abraham worships his whole life. Is just going from place to place. Remember, they're kind of a nomadic people. They're herders. And at each place, if it's time to worship, pile up some rocks, call on the name of the Lord, we're good. And this was one of the places where God was like, you've got to understand this. You have made it so complicated. You want soundboards, and you want multiple instruments, and you want harmonizing, and you want to be singing new songs every week. and you want, again, this, and you want that, and you have made worship so complicated in order for it to be pleasing to you. As a school leader, it was worse because then I felt responsible. So I almost never enjoyed those worship times because anytime there was a problem, I'm like slipping back. I'm like, doesn't the sound guy realize that the piano is too loud? Why isn't he turning it down? And so I'd just kind of slide over there, you know, right? Because it just bothered me. Every single detail that wasn't lining up, or if someone wasn't leading worship and leading worship. You know what I mean? They were just singing a 4-set song and then done. And I'm like, you're wasting this opportunity. Why don't we have open worship? Why don't you just allow for people to speak out something that's on their heart, you know, or do this or that? So I just become this critical judge. And God said, can it be this simple? Could it really be this simple? That it's just a pile of rocks and calling out the name of the Lord. And that's really what I'm looking for at the heart of worship. And we've just made it so complicated about form and about music styles and all that stuff. We just need rocks. That's basically all we need. All right, it goes on. We discussed this a little bit the other day, so I'm not going to go over it again. But I do believe that there was a big message about worship with Abraham and Isaac. And we don't get it because we don't live at a time where we do human sacrifice, but they did. And there was a big communication from God in that He doesn't desire human sacrifice. And He provided the ram instead of having to offer His only Son. All right, let's go forward to worship and the Exodus. So let's turn forward to the book of Exodus. And again, when we look at this, he was supposed to deliver this message to the Pharaoh. And this message that he was supposed to deliver to the Pharaoh is, allow my people to go out into the wilderness and worship me for 3 days. What do you think of that? I mean, first of all, you ask, well, isn't that kind of deceptive? God doesn't just want them out there for 3 days. Isn't he really there so that he can free them forever? Is it just kind of a little game plan, a little deception on God's part? Let's just let us get out into the wilderness, and then we'll take off and we'll keep running. Well, I don't see that in the character and nature of God. I believe that this was kind of a first step, actually. That God was being merciful with Pharaoh. And instead of just coming right to Pharaoh and say, let my people go totally, this was kind of his chance to make one step. Let them go out and spend these 3 days and come back. And then it may have led to, hopefully, a merciful process where eventually the Hebrews are freed. But Pharaoh rejects that, he hardens his heart, and then we have the rest of the story. But I think it's fascinating to me that the one thing God is asking for is some worship time. He doesn't come in. The first demand isn't freedom. The first demand isn't to let the people go and form their own nation and blah, blah, blah. The thing that God says He really wants is just 3 days of worship. And He's willing to go in there to raise up Moses, to send him in so that he can have the people come out. Why? So that they understand that He created them for love and relationship. What does God want with us? Is He just looking for His own slaves? No. He's looking for a people that will worship Him in spirit and in truth. And so from the very beginning of this redemptive plan of the story of Exodus, they know how important worship is to God. Because that's relational time. It's time where we are focused only on God, and He wanted them to go out into the wilderness where there's no distractions and there's nothing else going on, and they would just have these 3 days to get to know their God again. Because it's quite clear from the golden calf story, they don't know each other that well. Well, He knows them well, but they don't know Him that well. And He wants time with His people. And says, this is the thing that's most important. It's not your freedom. It's your heart. Wow. It's the fact, are you going to bow down? Are you going to serve me? Or are you going to serve other gods? Whether you're a slave or not, okay, He's obviously concerned about oppression. He wants that kind of freedom, but it's spiritual freedom that He came to bring to His people. So he leads them out. They cross the Red Sea, come out on the other side. What's the first thing they do? They worship, right? It's a big old cool worship time. Miriam grabs the tambourine, so that just tells you tambourines are necessary for prophetic worship. Better be purchasing some, the back. And dancing, also necessary. So yeah, they have this huge worship session. That's how they celebrate one of the most fantastic, amazing things that God has done for them. Miriam starts singing, they start singing a new song, and they dance around, and then they go to Mount Sinai, and God begins to give them the law. And I hope that you're able to recognize how much of the law is about worship. There's a lot about worship. Right? Some of it not as exciting as some other parts. We like the stories in Exodus. Your favorite part of Exodus may have not been the description of the tabernacle and every single item that goes into it and what it's supposed to look like. And then if it weren't bad enough that we get that blow by blow description of what it should look like, then they actually build it and they repeat those details all over again.